Hey everyone, this is Charley Thornton, and welcome to the Personal Primer podcast. Recently, I got a chance to catch up with a very interesting guy, Joe Byerly. Joe is an officer in the U.S. Army who served as a special advisor to the U.S. Special Operations Command in Afghanistan. He's also the recipient of the Army's General Douglas MacArthur Leadership Award, which is pretty impressive. Joe is a contributing author to a number of different books, and he's also the founder of From the Green Notebook, which is a really cool and very popular website where Joe and other leaders share lessons with their military peers across the country. Joe's an avid reader, and he's a student of history, and he recently read the biography Grant by Ron Chernow about General Ulysses S. Grant. And that's actually what sparked this conversation about how we may be learning the wrong lessons from historical figures. Let's listen in.
Everybody knows U.S. Grant, the Civil War hero, U.S. Grant, the president, the two-term president. And some people, even know that Grant wrote memoirs, which are a classic that Mark Twain helped get published. But what a lot of people don't know, and I think is very important, is the backstory. He wasn't destined to be a Civil War hero or U.S. president. And so one of the things that struck me when I was reading the book was, in the 1850s, Grant was a young, newly commissioned officer, and he had a drinking problem. And it wasn't like, he was throwing back some beers before work in the morning and then going and being a functioning alcoholic. But it was when he was drinking, at a social function, he just couldn't stop. And Grant was typically a very reserved guy, very quiet gentleman. But when he drank, he would just start, his character got kind of crazy. He was the wild guy at the Christmas party with the lampshade on their head. And so, this eventually got him in some hot water, so much so that his commander had him sign a letter of resignation, or had him write his own letter of resignation, not put a date on it. And I think he even had him sign it, ahead of time, just didn't date it, and said, if you get drunk one more time, all right, and embarrass yourself, then you're resigning from the United States Army. And so, of course, Grant did. He had a little too much to drink and had to leave the Army. And so he had to go back home with his wife, and he was raising two children, two boys, and he just tried to make it in the civilian world. He tried his hand at a couple different jobs, tried to start some businesses, and all those were failing. And so at 38 years old, so how old are you, Charley?
I'm going to be 38 in a few months. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm 39. So think about where you're at in your life right now. And, I think about where I'm at, and I just couldn't imagine, having to call my parents up and be like, hey, mom, dad, I'm struggling. I need you to take the wife and kids. We're going to move back home and try to get my feet under me. And so that's exactly what Grant did.
Wow.
So he went back to his hometown where his dad had a store, and Grant at 38 years old got a job working in the store as a clerk, got a small little house, and was just trying to start over. Like I said, get his feet under him.
So it was like a pretty low level job.
Yeah. And just imagine the, as I was reading this, I was trying to put myself in his shoes, and just, having to, just kind of suck up all that pride that you have. And it kind of admitting that your life isn't going where you thought it would be.
And this was a guy, I'm assuming he went to West Point or something.
He did, yeah.
Which, certainly now, and I'm assuming then carried some prestige with it, right?
It did, yeah. For his father, that was a huge, source of pride, was his son being a West Point graduate and being a United States Army officer. And so it was a big deal, and so, Grant's, here he is back hometown, having to start over. And so the year was 1859. Okay. And as you know, in 1861, the Civil War kicks off. And, the Union Army has to greatly expand, just lost all the Confederate states. And so here's Grant's chance at redemption and to come back in. And what's interesting is that, he recognized how he messed up the first time. He's like, I'm going to learn from this mistake. And so his chief of staff was kind of like his Jiminy Cricket conscience, and so
Hmm.
he was very defensive over Ulysses Grant, and he made sure that alcohol wasn't around him, and he was very, even so much so that there was a point where Grant got drunk, like much later into the war when things are going really well. And he basically gets a letter from his chief of staff being like, "You should be ashamed of yourself. I didn't sign up, to follow you along the course of the war, for you to make mistakes like this. And, you were successful, previously in the war. Like, you got to this point because you hadn't been drinking. You've been staying true to yourself." So between his chief of staff and when his wife would visit the camp, they kind of kept him from alcohol because he knew he had a weakness for it. And so
Yeah.
that was one of the things that he made sure he did was have something in place to keep him from doing that.
How? Because I'm a civilian, right? So in a military context, how much courage does that take for a chief of staff to call somebody out like that? Is that the norm? Is that unique?
It takes a lot of personal courage. Like, even back then, and even today, it would take a lot of courage for somebody to have to. I mean, essentially, you're standing up to your boss
Yeah.
and saying, "Hey, sir, like, you're wrong, and here's why."
Like he could have fired this guy if he wanted.
He could have, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it took a lot on Grant's part to recognize that, hey, this is my weakness, and this guy is here to help me combat that weakness.
Got it. Interesting. And then okay, so this guy would sort of keep him in line. And then what? The rest is history. I mean,
Yeah,
he wins
exactly.
the
So
war.
yeah, he he wins the war, or he helps the North win the war, ends up becoming a president, and then it's funny too because he went from this nobody, I mean, a nobody failure, right, to Civil War general to president of the United States. And so when he left the office, he struggled with letting go of power, and so as a result of that, he was still trying to chase that influence, still trying to chase, being in the mix, and so it eventually led to him getting into business with a young Bernie Madoff, and so his business partner was using Grant's name to get clients, and meanwhile he was orchestrating one of the largest Ponzi schemes at the time. And so
No way.
uh, when the card deck eventually fell, like, Grant was penniless. I think he had like $18 to his name, and eventually,
A former
uh,
U.S. president,
yeah,
and he's
yeah,
the and he's like, I mean, I imagine he was a national hero for
he
for
was,
his
and
role in the Civil War.
people were actually like, it was like the equivalent of a GoFundMe in the late 1800s. People were actually sending him money to help him, pay the bills because people felt
Wow.
that bad for him. And it's funny too because his friend uh, Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, who was like one of his go-to general throughout the war, always questioned whether Grant was going to be able to make it, in the presidency, because you're no longer with soldiers, you're now with politicians, and his choices later on, still chasing the money, still chasing the dream. And so there's a great quote he said about his friend. He said that, all the millionaires that Grant tried to hang out with would have given their entire fortunes to just win one of Grant's battles. And yet here he is, you know, still trying to be a part of this crowd. And so eventually it led to his financial ruin. And so thankfully Mark Twain came along and convinced him to write a biography. And he didn't need much convincing, or his memoir. He didn't need much convincing because he needed something to make sure his family was taken care of when he passed away, because he had also just discovered that he had cancer. And so he wrote ferociously over the last few years of his life to finish his memoirs. And so it's a great story, and I think that again, what kind of drew me to this story is the messiness of Grant's life. But like when I say Ulysses S. Grant, the first thing you think of is either general or president,
Yeah,
hero.
I mean, I think of like a gruff dude, war weary, making tough calls. I think of a badass, really.
Yeah, and
You
I,
know,
I think I think it's a two-dimensional view, right? Like it's just one aspect of Grant when there was, you know, as you look in the three-dimensional picture of the human being, you start seeing the flaws, you start seeing the messiness of his life. And I think it's within there that you can find, that's where you can really find the lessons that you can pull from, to be a better leader, a better father, a better husband. And so that's what I really appreciated from that biography.
fascinating, fascinating. And so, did he? So he gets these memoirs out, and then did he kind of die in a good place, or like?
Yeah, the cancer eventually it took him, but it was pretty quickly. Like he was, they didn't think he was actually going to finish the memoirs. Like he got to a point where I believe he was he started handwriting them at first, but then as the cancer progressed, he started dictating, and then was barely getting it out before he passed away. So I want to say he finished the manuscript, and it wasn't much time after that before he finally passed.
Got it. So you mentioned that we sort of have this two-dimensional picture of this great war hero president, but we don't see all the. I mean, it sounds like the guy made a lot of bad decisions in his life, and
Yeah,
we don't always see all those.
no, we don't. And it's almost it's we kind of do the same thing with social media, with Facebook, with Twitter, with Instagram. We see the picture perfect, these picture perfect manicured snapshots of our friends and families' lives, and we don't see the rest of it. And there's even been studies that have shown that like depression, anxiety are much higher because that's what we focus on. And I think we do the same thing with our heroes too. Is we just focus on the highlights of their lives, their successes, and we don't look into the journey, how they got there and the mistakes they made along the way.
Why do you think that happens? I mean, obviously Facebook didn't affect U.S. Grant's legacy, hopefully, but like, why would that picture evolve so far from reality?
I think it's just something that we've always done. Plutarch wrote about the lives of great people, and he
Yeah,
wrote it, I believe, in the first century. And he talks about Alexander's generals all started getting their haircuts and everything like Alexander had, just to try to imitate him, but they didn't do all the back work that Alexander put into being a great general. And so I think it's just a human thing. Like we want, like life hacks are super popular. Like we want the shortcut.
yeah,
We just see something and we don't think about, the journey that the people took to get there. All the stuff that's on the cutting room floor. There's another great example, like Bill Belichick. Like he's a great football coach, and I think he's going to go down in history as one of the greatest. I'm not a Belichick fan, um, but
just gonna put
but
that disclaimer out there.
by the way, I should have said that up front. But what I think is fascinating is Bill, as a young assistant coach, spent hours and hours and hours. Like his job was to set the tape footage for the other coaches to watch. And so that was a lot
Mm.
of watching film, cutting, taping it back together because this was before the digital era. And so in doing that, Bill watched a lot of football. He got to learn the game, the basics of the game. And so now, flash forward 20, 30 years later, we see the Belichick that's won multiple Super Bowls, and that's the Belichick we focus on. We don't see the young kid in there with scissors and Scotch tape, just slowly watching the
Yeah,
game.
because they probably did use scissors back then too.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a good point. I mean, you kind of think of like, just sort of feel like Bill Belichick's always been this way, so confident, and he's kind of a rough around the edges or whatever. But I suppose he had to develop that acumen over time.
Yeah. I think that's that's one of the things that I've just become obsessed. Not obsessed, but I've just been very interested in reading biographies lately. Like, what's the backstory? Like, how did somebody get from point A to point B? Like, again, Stephen King. He's a prolific writer. He's written. It seems like he just produces a novel every year or so. But Stephen King writes 500 words a day religiously. Regardless of time of year, regardless of what's going on. Like, he's developed a habit over the years. But you back up the timeline before that. He got a lot of rejection notices when he first started writing, and eventually, like, he taped them up on the wall in his room. But they got so great that he took like a giant railroad spike and put it into the wall and just started stacking the rejection notices up. But through that process, he learned how to be a great writer.
Jeez, that's a lot of failure. A railroad spike is really long.
It is, Charlie. It is. But like, we don't see that. We skip right to the success people have, and we don't think about all the mundane, boring things that it takes to get to that point.
Okay, so what's the risk in that then?
I think the risk in that is we try to hold ourselves to like this super high standard without putting in the work to get to that. So it's like we're always going to meet failure. Like, if you and I decided that we were going to go, try out for the NBA, and we went to a team tryouts tomorrow, we would fail, and we would just keep repeating this process over and over again. But what we didn't take into account is like the hours, that so many of these players spent on the Saturdays, just perfecting their free throw, or perfecting, something as boring as dribbling, right? And so I think that's a huge problem that we have, is we just like fast forward to the end, and we forget all that other stuff. And so we're going to constantly be met with failure because we didn't put in the work to get there. Or, another thing that I've learned in a lot of these biographies. So, going back to Grant, right? Like, his failure with drinking, getting kicked out of the Army, was so, it was such a formative event in his life that, that was something that was always in the forefront of his mind, was the effects of alcohol on thinking. And so, coming up in the Army, like, his Army, they did really well. Like, he didn't even allow alcohol in the camps. I mean, it happened, because, soldiers will find a way to work around the system. But he knew that, this was something that affected judgment and affected people in such a way that if he wanted to be a winning general, he would have to make sacrifices. And so you look at a lot of the presidents of, who've led through tumultuous times, again, like, diving into their biographies. Roosevelt was a super sickly kid. Teddy Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, was hit with polio early on in his political career, and had to face the adversity of going through the rehab and all that, which potentially set him up for the adversity he had to deal with as leading the United States through World War II. So I think that's where we can learn from these people, not necessarily in the end product,
Yeah. I'm just wondering why people are reluctant to tell those stories. I don't know. Do they think it cheapens the good things that people did if you see the underbelly of it, or the warts, or the failures,
Yeah, I think it's a human thing. Like, in the military, I love, like, one of the questions, like, if you ask somebody, like, hey, how did you get to where you're at today? How did you get to be a commander of this unit? They'll start telling a story. And a lot of times, the stories, it's polished, right? Like, so that's all the good things that happened. And what they tend to leave out are all the times they failed and all the times that things didn't go the way they wanted it to. Yet those actually ended up setting the stage for their future opportunities, you know?
So in that situation, you end up walking out with like the wrong checklist to achieve success.
Yeah, exactly. You walk away with the Facebook, Instagram post with the really good filter, and
Yeah. Okay.
and not the reality of the situation.
So it's if I want to be Alexander the Great, first thing on my checklist is haircut.
Haircut. Yep.
Yeah. And because you can fake a haircut. Um, you can fake a lot of things. But I mean, back to your NBA analogy, if we tried out for the NBA, it wouldn't be good, at least on
No.
my end. But you can't. I mean, I could buy the right shoes and wear the right clothes, but I can't fake the thousands of hours of and God-given talent or whatever.
Yeah, and then the other thing too, I think that we also do when we look at some of these historical figures is that we don't think about the trade-off, right? Like we don't think about all the things that they had to give up, say no to get to that point, right? So another great example is Frederick Douglass. You know, one of the greatest orators of the 19th century. He did so much to drive us to the point where we had the Emancipation Proclamation, for blacks' rights, and to he was an ardent abolitionist, but he also had, and he traveled. That's the other thing. He traveled the world speaking. Like in the 19th century, he was one of the most recognized speakers in all the world, right?
Really?
And that's amazing. Thinking he came up as a slave, and now here he is, this famous person. But what we don't think about is that Frederick Douglass had a wife. He had several children, and if you're busy speaking to all these people and you're traveling the world, what are you not doing?
Hanging out with the kids, hanging out with the
Yeah,
wife.
yeah. So
Yeah.
he he neglected a lot of he neglected the raising of his kids and kind of put that off on his wife. And so as a grown man, he spent a lot of time trying to right those wrongs, and he spent a lot of time trying to keep his children supported who had a hard time standing on their own. So he kind of paid for that later in life. So I think it's a big thing, is like, what are you willing to trade for greatness? Bill Bradley, the basketball great, going back to the basketball. He would 8 hours on a Saturday. He would just sit there and shoot all day, just practice
Mm.
when he was in high school. I know when I was in high school on Saturdays, like I was hanging out, having a good time with my friends. I wasn't working on mastery of any craft, and so Bill gave those up, for his greatness. So I think, when you really start peeling the stories back on all these people that did great things, whether through leadership, whether through inventing, there's this backstory of things that they had to say no to, the trade-offs.
To say the big yeses, they had to say a lot of little no's
Yeah,
over and
yeah,
over and over again.
absolutely. Yeah, and
Yeah.
sometimes the doors they closed worked out for them, and sometimes it didn't.
It's funny because as we're having this conversation, I keep getting this image of my high school Latin teacher in a toga giving the speech from Julius Caesar where he goes, the evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones.
Ooh,
And I don't know. I don't know
that
if
was
that's
deep.
true. It's deep. I don't know if it's what we're talking about, but it seems like with a lot of these characters, it's maybe the reverse.
Right.
It's we have this shining image of them, whether it's, Honest Abe or George Washington cutting down the apple tree or whatever. But is that helpful ultimately to have that sort of two-dimensional image? And I think you've shared some really cool reasons why maybe it's not, and why maybe a deeper look would actually help us get away from the haircuts and get toward the underlying stuff that really matters.
Man, that's a great way of putting it, Charlie.
Now, Joe, thank you so much. This has been really enlightening, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, it'd be great. Thanks for having me, Charlie.